to the first ever episode of Let That Shit Go, the show where we let go of anything that misaligns with your highest self. I'm your host, Gianna, certified life coach with a degree in psychology. And today we're going to deep dive into the concept of the ego. Joining me are two incredible guests who bring their unique coaching perspectives to this topic. Please welcome Genia and Jesse Silva.
Hello. Happy to be here. Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. It's my pleasure. I wouldn't want anybody else to be my first host on this show. So
grateful, honored.
Very proud to be your first.
Thank you. So I have some questions for you guys about your perspectives and your learnings around the ego. So why don't we start by defining the ego for our listeners?
That is a great idea.
That's a great place to start. Go ahead.
You guys are so cute. I love it.
You have any answer?
Gosh, it's hard to, how do you define, the ego? That's a tough one, because I think it's in everything and nothing. I don't think there's actually a specific definition that sort of would fit it.
Oh, see, I think we've talked about this so many times. I have our definition of the ego that we learned from Miss Brene Brown years ago. Think of a small version of yourself.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
A childlike version of yourself, because that's where we learn quite a bit, maybe not all, of the rules and beliefs that end up carrying into our adulthood, and for placing that ego into what we're all used to as far as an ego, because I think most people are, I guess, connected to the idea that ego, if somebody's got an ego, that means they're larger than life, that behaviors come out of them that make them that target of they have an ego. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually kind of fair. Yeah. But where the child version, what we had heard from Dr. Brown and then discussed, and I think a lot of it actually came through our discussion, not necessarily what we had just read or listened to. But the idea is it's less important that you've defined the ego. The ego is a part of ourselves. I've also heard the me and I concept. Mm-hmm. So I am I, and me is the ego, because me is the essence in which I can only access and talk with and be with on the inside. Mm. And so if I spend time looking at me, see, it's kind of cool how that works.
Yeah, well, it's tricky.
The me, I can look at the me and I can recognize that, I'm triggered, and so there's this reaction that I have that comes from my beliefs, because I should be treated a certain way or not disrespected, or of course that's kind of the darker edge of it. But that's me reacting. It's not I.
And I think that's why I have more of a difficult time defining the ego, right? Because I think it's like trying to define self. There's so many multifaceted layers and, myriad of qualities. I don't think that there's one definition, for me anyway, that's this is the definition of ego. I can talk about the definition of the ego versus someone that's being egoic, which I think a lot of times we, misinterpret the ego for, the egoic, that larger in life person that you said, right?
Egotistical, egoic.
Egotistical, that person is egotistical, they got a big head, which is completely different than the ego. So I think, when you say define it, that's why there's, many concepts that try to define it, but I don't think there's an actual one that I feel comfortable. This is the definition that I'm going to stick with. Yeah. It'd be like defining myself. Oh God. What day is it? What time is it? Who's showing up?
I hate to flip it back onto the host of the podcast, but what is ego to you, Gianna?
Yeah, exactly. And this is why I wanted you guys on here, because I love your back and forth banter, because I know Genia is more of the emotional side of things. Jesse, you are the more logical side of things. So I love seeing that dynamic. But Yeah, I love the way that you described, like, typically people think of the ego as like, yeah, you have this big ego, right? But it's also not just the big parts of ourselves, but the small parts of ourselves too, that inner child that's just looking to feel seen and loved. And, it's all the hurts and the traumas and the insecurities. And that's what I feel makes up the ego, because it's driven by external validation, and that pride and praise, right? Rather than, I like to compare the ego to like the intuition, in the sense that I think about the ego as the inner child and also the mind. Like, the mind is a little bit different than the body. The mind is going to tell us, like, well, you shouldn't be resting. You should be doing your homework or getting work done or cleaning or doing this or doing that. And the body, the intuition, knows exactly what we're needing and when. But that ego comes in and it's kind of like, no, you should be further ahead. You should be making a family and doing all of these things and worrying about all the stuff that's going to get you that external praise and validation. So, that's kind of how I see the ego. But I know the more psychological definition of it is, it's the self and it's the balance between the id, like our instincts, our intrusive thoughts, and the superego, which is more of the morals and, like that side of things as well. So I like to think like the id's the devil on the shoulder, the superego's the angel, and then we are the ego. So that's another way that I learned through psychology.
No, I love that.
No, that's
That's a
great.
great way to look at it. And I mean, it serves its purpose. And then remember, I mean, at the very basic level, the ego's job is to protect
Right.
and defend.
Right. Yeah.
And as you said, it's that part of you that's the inner child. It is a part of you that is part of your inner child, but not only just the inner child, but all of your experiences through your entire life. And it is always seeking, opportunities, whether warranted or not, to protect and defend us from harm or perceived harm.
Right. Yeah. I love those shares and those answers. And it kind of like led us right into our next question. What are some of the common signs of those ego-driven behaviors? So, Gina, you mentioned the protection aspect and the safety. But
Right. How it sort of manifests, you pick up social media, and you see, a post that you don't agree with, and all of a sudden you're like, there's your ego in action. It's protecting you,
yeah.
from these words on the page, or you receive a text from someone that you don't like, and you're, activated, that would be the ego, taking charge of your emotions, or someone says something you don't like.
Right.
Now, I agree, and I think a great exercise, and I've done this before, but it's been a very long time. Sit down, reflect over the past day or two, and write down as many trigger moments as you possibly can. And I think those are indicative of the ego. Now, granted, there might be some trigger moments of happiness, of camaraderie, of joy. Obviously, those are also ego.
Yeah, absolutely. But they serve.
Well, and not only do they serve, but the ego's not driving the behavior that comes from the trigger, because it doesn't need to, because there's nothing to protect. There's nothing there.
There's nothing to protect or nothing to defend.
But if you flip over onto the other side of, okay, well, let me look at the behaviors and the triggers that where, felt really bad, or felt, at least minimally bad, you can find a very strong pattern, and it's fear. So you could say that the examples of the ego all contain fear, which makes sense, because if, as Genia said, it's the ego is there to protect, then obviously there's no reason to protect if there's no fear. Fear ends up being at the center of each. It could be small fears. It could be the fears that are not necessarily the ones where classic example, you're driving down the freeway and somebody cuts you off.
Mhm.
And all of a sudden you're flooded with the emotions, both somatically and thought wise.
Yeah.
It is the ego because you were in fear, even if in that moment of your life. But then the smaller ones start to come. And I say smaller because I think they're less.
Oh, well, maybe not smaller, but secondary.
Yeah, secondary. Yeah. Like, oh, that person just disrespected me because they didn't care who I was. And now,
absolutely,
I have to prove myself. So now I've got to consider what physical gestures I'm going to display and what words I'll fling out the window. And those behaviors are in response to fear, fear of being seen as less than. And I think we can find those.
Or fear of not being seen at all.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, obviously, if you got really close when he cut you off, absolutely. And what's funny about that, we talk about this, regularly. There's truth in that. The truth is you aren't seen by that other driver. And that, that's why that trigger hits so deep. And it's not the reality of that person not seeing you. It's your thought of that person not respecting, seeing, acknowledging, fearing,
which directly goes down into that subconscious that the ego is protecting and defending of not feeling worthy. Obviously, someone that's in that moment, the person that's cut off by that driver on the car, that's like, oh, that was startling, and moves on with their day.
Yeah.
That's a healthier way of, moving through life. Whereas the person that was cut off, and all of a sudden, oh my God, that jerk, they just did that to me, they did it on purpose. They didn't see, it goes directly, the story starts happening, and it drills down to the place where that person who was cut off by the car has this feeling of the unworthiness, whereas the ego is activated to protect and defend that till its dying day. It wants to kill everything in his sight. So all of a sudden, oh my God, that driver's a jerk. And not only is that driver a jerk, but he was driving a white car. So now everybody that drives a white car is a jerk. And it just
I drive a white car.
Wow.
Jesse.
Oopsie.
So obviously, like that fear, whether it's, fear of fear itself, right? So fear is what kind of drives the ego. So how else can you determine if the ego is what's driving the conversation in your mind?
Curiosity. What am I, you feel yourself activated or triggered, right? What am I protecting? What am I defending?
Yeah.
Ask yourself, what's going on? I'm feeling activated. I'm feeling triggered. What am I protecting? What am I afraid of? What am I defending? And, sit with yourself for a minute and you will get the answer.
Yeah. And what's great about your answer about protecting and defending, I think defending to me is a pretty strong key in answering your question. Where, think about that defense. Think of if you were to ask yourself that question in a moment of being triggered and defending, I am defending, I'm defending in that moment, that's all happening inside of you.
Yeah.
Having nothing to do with the other person or the external circumstance. If you can use curiosity to get to that point, well, now you've got a gem to play with, for quite some time. And no matter what you unpack from that, it's going to benefit you because now you have some awareness around, sure, an external event that drove inside. But if there was no connection, if it didn't trigger you, then it wouldn't even be a thought. It wouldn't even be an example.
Right. You just go
but the fact that it did means there's some truth. Now, not ultimate truth, but truth that you believe.
Right.
Yeah. And
that's where the shame comes in.
Right. So you mentioned self-awareness. How does this concept of the ego, how does that tie into concepts such as like mindfulness, self-awareness, and like your own personal growth? So you said self-awareness of like your own triggers and behaviors, responses, right?
Right.
Is there any other piece that connects to that self-awareness?
Well, we spoke about curiosity, like what's really going on right now. right? What am I really reacting to at the moment, right? And having conversations with yourself. We're allowed to have conversations with ourselves. We're not all crazy, but that's how we learn about ourselves, is by having these conversations. What's really going on here, right? What am I really reacting to here? Well, I'm reacting because these people don't know how to, turn the camera lens internally rather than externally, right? And you'll learn a little bit about yourself. This activated me. You're continually getting activated, and I like the word activated rather than triggered. Triggered is getting so boring.
What, from the trigger queen?
It's so I know. I mean, I love triggering people because triggers are teachers for sure. But I'm really embracing the word activated, because activated could mean it's positive or negative, right? I'm feeling activated. I mean, I'm full of joy right now. Right. I'm feeling activated where I'm feeling, kind of salty about something. But yeah, it's about, in that moment, what's really going on here? And that's how you begin to develop some self-awareness.
Yeah.
Having conversations with, well, this happened today, and wow, God, my reaction was way off the rails. What was going on with you in that moment? Like, what was really happening? Oh, well, this is what's really happening. You were, worried about, not being seen. You were, it's a theme with you that you're always feeling unworthy. And, this person that cut you off in traffic just kind of confirmed that belief that you have of your own self, of your worthiness spectrum.
I think what Genia just described, Gabor Mate speaks about, is conscious inquiry, which is exactly it. I also think that having that conversation with someone else in a trusted environment, obviously, be it a life coach, a friend, I think it can kind of flow both ways. So I imagine, what would that coach ask you about those feelings? If you can't, ask yourself those questions, because asking yourself those questions does definitely come down the road of self-awareness, of developing self-awareness. You might watch a video, read a book, hear somebody talk, and you'll learn, oh, okay, so I've got to, commit to some conscious inquiry, some self exploration, some questions. But having those from someone else can do it, I think, even better, which is exactly why you do what you do, Gianna, and that can be tremendously helpful. Because self-awareness it's funny, we've had the conversation of, where does the journey begin? And it begins, we both agree, with awareness.
Right.
But is it self-awareness, or is it awareness that there could be difference down the road, there could be change down the road? And if you're at that point, if you have the awareness that there can be, okay, great. Now the self-awareness really becomes the conveyance. The path is awareness, but self-awareness is the vehicle you hop into to take that path.
Right.
And it can be tough. And the first character you run into is the ego.
Sure.
If, of course, you're willing and able to recognize it.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah. So it almost sounds like the ego can aid in the personal growth through becoming more aware of it, and then basically deciding, is this helpful or not? Like, do I want to choose to go down that path, or go down and spiral into whatever self-limiting beliefs or self-judgment that this ego is bringing up for me? Or do I want to change the pattern and make a different choice?
Yeah, and you're right there. You're talking about conscious intention. Listen, the ego has been doing its job, for hundreds of thousands of years, right? And it's very good at what it does in our own personal lives. It's basically the autopilot that we run on, right? And it's so good, and it basically goes through like unnoticed. We can live led by the ego, our entire lives, and that's okay. And some people choose that, and that's okay.
Right.
And because it is so, what's the word? It's slight. It's almost unnoticeable. How this happens, I react. you know, you're going through life playing whack-a-mole. That happens, I react. But what you're talking about with the self-awareness is taking, you know, conscious intention back, you know, putting yourself back into the steering wheel, right? Whereas ego's been driving the car the whole time. Now you're like, okay, not so much. This isn't really working for me. You know, I'm tired of being angry. I'm tired of being sad. I'm tired of hating the world. I'm getting tired of my own self and my own ego. There must be a better way. And it's about, you know, taking the reins slowly away from the ego. That's and like becoming conscious, intentional.
Right. I was gonna say that's like the biggest like magic trick I would say I've been able to like perform for my clients, because like once they realize that they don't have to react anymore, or like that they can change the cycle or the pattern in any relationship, even relationships with a super narcissistic abusive partner, like they have been able to take back their control just by adjusting the thought pattern and having a different response. And it's just creating the awareness of the way that you respond and what the trigger is, and like what self-limiting belief has formed and is like coming out and making you defensive, and working through reframing that, or, you know, being like, okay, this action or this behavior is no longer serving me. I'm going to intend to do something different. It helps you get your power back.
Sure. And what you're talking about there is a fundamental change of your relationship with yourself.
Right.
Number one, that will change every other dynamic in your life across the board. Yeah. It all starts with us.
And you use the phrase limiting beliefs.
Yes.
A byproduct of the ego, because those limiting beliefs were put into place to protect.
It's true.
You know, something happened, or a series of things happened, and and I'll say the word good, a good response happened, like you responded well and it worked. And the next time that external event occurred and you were in that same position, maybe you remembered, maybe it was just an impulse memory, and so you did it again. And what happens is that habit begins to get formed.
Yeah.
And we now call that later on in years a limiting belief, because it's actually armored you up and it's keeping you from fully engaging.
Yeah.
Well, that's a great example of going back to, you know, to what the ego has done, you know, probably not necessarily in a negative way, but in a way that limits us.
Right.
You also had mentioned the positive effects of the ego, and you know, the woman sitting to my right, I had to do the whole left right thing there for a second, is absolutely responsible for me recognizing that I'd heard others say it, but I think it was just the way in which, you know, you and I have talked about it so much. Without the ego, you'd be dead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
There would be no self-preservation. There would be no grit in moments where the grit would allow you to survive. Instead, apathy, and you'd be dead.
Yeah. The ego is wonderful at doing its job.
But driving the car, so to speak,
right?
You know, and maybe it can be said that we all end up at one point with the ego driving.
Sure.
And we have that moment, maybe that friend says something, maybe something in a movie triggers us, and we go, oh, wait, does it really have to be this way?
Right.
And that begins that process.
When you identify or discover that the ego exists, that we all have one, that it typically, you know, I guess you could say kind of has a mind of its own, is the ego capable of evolving with us? What happens to it, right? Like if you start this practice of mindfulness, start to uncover these self-limiting beliefs, you start working through them, reframing them, regaining your power, what happens to the ego then? Does it get stronger?
I absolutely believe 100%, you know, it grows with us. And it's absolutely, you know, like all parts of us, it's capable of transformation and integration. I see a lot on social media, oh, kill the ego this, and
Yeah.
the enemy that, and bad ego, not your amigo. I think that's the wrong message. I think it's more about integrating, the ego, um, rather than killing. We're not at war with ourselves. I think we've been sold a lie that we have these bad parts of ourselves, and not true. So yeah, absolutely, the ego can evolve and grow and transform along with us. I mean, look, children, little kids, age birth, toddlers, they're 100% ego driven, right? When they don't give a fluff about anything. The world revolves around them.
Okay, this
They're
is called
happy
Let
as a
That Shit Go.
clam.
You can say
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
I didn't know we were gonna be
you have
censored.
permission.
Yeah. They don't give a shit. They're running around, 100%, egocentric. The world revolves around them. They're laughing, they're playing. And then 1 minute they're crying and this and that, and it's all good. And the ego is absolutely serving them, right? It's, as we evolve as humans, then the ego starts, absorbing these messages from its, environment. You're too loud, you're too skinny, you're not good enough, and this, that, and that's all it does. It's like a big old storage system, a computer, whatever,
Hard drive.
hard drive thing. I'm not technical, but it starts, it's evolving, right? It's not really evolving very, in a very healthy way, but it is evolving, right? But it's doing it by itself. It's doing it automatically. We're not taking any agency really personally helping it because we didn't learn how. No one sat us down as children and said, listen, there's this part of your mind that's called the ego, and it's a sponge, and it is going to collect and record and react to every bad thing that's ever happened to you in your entire life forever. Like, no one has that conversation, right? So that's what I said. It just goes into this autopilot mode: protect, defend, protect, defend. The world is a terrible place. Protect, defend. And that's where we go until we're like, wait a minute, there's got to be a better way. So yes, with the conscious intention and the compassionate inquiry, we can absolutely transform it. And that was a really long answer, but I'm very passionate about that.
Absolutely.
Passion. Yes, I need passion.
That's it. I heard a metaphor once about a ball of yarn. And if you consider our emotional growth, and strictly the emotional growth, because that's where all of this stems from, as a small piece of yarn when you're a child. And then, by the age of 20, 30, 40, whatever, that ball of yarn has grown and grown and grown. And the process is to unravel it.
Yeah.
When you do, you're going to find that you can't get rid of it. It's still going to be there, but now you understand it. Self-awareness. And now instead of the automatic, impulsive, habitual reactions, you can become conscious about those reactions. And you're doing that with the ego. I mean, if you didn't have the ego at that point, you wouldn't look for the journey, you wouldn't find the vehicle, and you wouldn't hop in it, you wouldn't go anywhere. You would just continue. So it's absolutely always there. But straight answer to your question, yes, I think we all three absolutely agree that the ego can be regulated to better suit who we are at any given moment. Yeah.
Well, because it almost seems like trying to kill off the ego or trying to control it actually makes it bigger, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely. If you try to go to war, with something, it's going to make it bigger. Did you ever, woken up in the middle of the night and like you have like a thought, maybe some thought that's been on your mind all day, whether it's work, relationship, all of a sudden you have a thought that's you really don't want to be having at 3 a.m. because you want to be sleeping. And then you start, I don't want to have this thought, go away. But the thought gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And, or, if you've ever, tried to argue or take a toy away from a little person, a child, and then it never goes well either. The ego will get louder. So it's not about worrying. It's okay. Let me hear what you have to say. What are you trying to tell me here, ego? What's going on? right? Because once you accept it and befriend it and integrate it, okay, ego, I hear what you're saying, but you know what? I'm gonna do this. We're gonna be okay here. I'm gonna make this choice anyway. It's about taking back your own agency and your own power. You know, from the unconscious reactionary mode to the conscious, intentional creation.
Right. And that was such a beautiful explanation. I feel like it's not about letting go of the ego or trying to fix or change or resist it. It's letting go of the shame and like the guilt or fear around it, for like past versions of yourself, how you guys were saying earlier of like that inner child, or, just mistakes or things that you'd done in the past that created the self-limiting beliefs that the ego holds on to. And it's that constant reminder. It's like, it's not letting go of the ego itself. It's letting go of the shame. And like you were saying, Genia, befriending it, finding acceptance for it. Yes. Exactly.
Right. That's why I get very passionate and people, oh, the ego, death and kill the ego. I'm like, it's not about you don't want, there's nothing wrong with it. It's serving its purpose. It's not a war,
It's not an enemy.
And it's not your enemy.
The ego is the enemy. Great book.
Great book. It can be a dangerous message because then, someone had, oh, I got to kill the ego. All of a sudden they have an egoic reaction to something. And now they're oh God, there's something wrong with me. Like you said, I have to fix this.
Right.
There's nothing to fix. You're not broken. We all have, it's just a part of ourselves that has evolved with the rest of us. And it's picked up some habits in its effort to protect and defend. Its meaning is pure, its methods, maybe not so much.
I think that we can wrap that whole answer into the idea that you both said it a couple of times, but really it being the answer, befriending it. I mean, what happens when you've identified you've got an enemy at work, or somebody who you have decided you don't like, and maybe their behaviors have kind of told yourself and everybody else that they don't like you. And then you befriend them, you find some common ground, you build a relationship. Now, I mean, if you imagine the ego has spent its entire life protecting, but here's the deal, short of life-threatening, well, another person that quote Peter Crone says, if it's not life-threatening, it's ego-threatening.
Ooh, I love that.
Yeah, well,
Isn't that a great one?
We love our Crone. And if you think about the concept of befriending that enemy, so to speak, what happens? Well, now that it's sitting next to you, now it's still piping up, and it's offering you up things to do or things to say or behaviors to behave in those bizarre situations. But because it's your friend, now you're conscious of it, and you can do exactly what Genia said and say, you know what? No, this time I think I'm going to go this route. Thank you very much, ego. Yeah. And now it's your partner, right? Which is far from killing, far from battling, far from war. It's actually, it's a bit of self-love.
Yes. Yes, it is. It is self-love and acceptance, right? Because that's the only way we really can let shit go, is through unconditional acceptance, love, compassion. That's the higher self. That's those higher levels of consciousness.
And how do you feel when you behave and think that way? Peace, freedom, all those great feelings come up. Absolutely. And the whole time, the ego is still there, and you've accepted it. It's there, and that in the moments where you need defense, where you need a savior, it's there. It's just not the one leading every moment of your life.
Leading the charge.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, you don't have to listen to everything your friend tells you what to do, right? If your friend told you to jump off a cliff, would you? That sort of thing.
Only if it was my ego.
Oh yeah. I think a good message is, your ego is your amigo.
Oh, I
There
love
you
that,
go.
guys.
There you go.
We'll leave with that.
That's the back of the t-shirt.
Yeah,
Yep.
that's the new bumper sticker.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you guys so much for joining me and giving all these wise words to really help even deepen my understanding of the ego as well. And hopefully whoever's listening to us, wanted to thank everybody else for tuning in to the first ever episode of Let That Shit Go.
Awesome.
All
Thank you,
right.
Gianna. This
Thanks
is
for having
amazing.
us.